June 16, 1943. 7:40 in the morning. 25,000 feet above the Solomon Sea. A lone B-17 Flying Fortress hangs in clear air over the island of Bougainville. No escort fighters, no formation, no cover except what its crew carried inside. The aircraft's designation, B-17E, serial number 41-2666. The crew called it Old 666. And right now, curled into a glass sphere bolted to the belly of that plane, Technical Sergeant Forrest Dillman can see them. Through the curved plexiglass of his ball turret 15 feet below the aircraft's fuselage, he is watching, silently, precisely, as the first of the Japanese fighters begins to climb. Dillman is a big man folded into a space that measures roughly 44 inches in diameter. His knees are drawn up near his chin. Both hands rest on the grips of 2.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. He weighs 175 pounds. The turret he occupies weighs 1,200. He is alone in the glass, separated from his crewmates by a sealed hatch, dangling below the belly of the only American airplane within 600 miles. He has been awake since 2 in the morning. He took off from Port Moresby, New Guinea before 4 a.m. He has been in that turret for 4 hours. And now, below him, around him growing larger against the green of the island, 17 Japanese Zero fighters from the 251st Kokutai Naval Air Group are climbing to meet him. The standard doctrine for a lone B-17 in that situation in 1943 was simple. Pray for escort, and if none arrives, run. There is no escort. They are not running. In Dillman's left breast pocket, tucked against the cold metal wall of his flight suit, is a photograph. A small snapshot, creased from weeks of being folded and unfolded, his wife and their boy back in the States. He put it there every single time he climbed into this turret, the same way, same pocket, same side. He never explained why. His crewmates knew better than to ask. That photograph is going into combat with him now. Here's what you need to understand before we go any further. The average B-17 gunner in the Pacific in mid-1943 had a 1 in 3 chance of completing a full tour of 25 missions. The average engagement with Japanese fighters lasted between 8 and 12 minutes. What Forrest Dillman was about to experience would last 40 minutes. The longest sustained aerial dogfight in World War II Pacific history at that point. And he was going to fight every second of it from a single, fixed, rotating position. And what made it survivable, and what changed the way American bomber crews were armed for the rest of the war, was a decision that broke every rule the Army Air Forces had issued. Forrest Dillman was not supposed to be on this mission. He was the squadron's armament chief, a technical expert, the man responsible for keeping other aircraft's guns clean and calibrated. His job was on the ground, not in the air. But when Tech Sergeant Johnny Abel, the regular belly turret operator for Old 666, was bumped upstairs to fill an engineering vacancy left by a man grounded with malaria, someone had to go into the ball. The mission commander, Captain J. Zemer, asked Dillman directly. Dillman said yes without hesitation. That yes tells you something important about who this man was. Dillman had not grown up dreaming of gunfights in the sky, and he was a mechanic at heart. A man who understood machines the way a surgeon understands anatomy. Not just what the components were, but why they failed, when they would fail, and what you did when they did. He had spent months in New Guinea surrounded by broken guns on broken aircraft, watching crews come back from missions with stories of jammed weapons at the worst possible moments. He had listened to gunners describe engagements where the weapon froze, where the belt feed failed, where the traverse mechanism locked at the exact angle they needed most. He knew, before almost anyone else in the squadron, the fundamental problem with the standard defensive gunnery doctrine. It treated bomber gunners as passive deterrents, not active killers. And the official Air Force's position in 1943 was that bomber formation was the primary defensive tool. Pack enough aircraft together and the overlapping fields of fire created a wall that enemy fighters couldn't penetrate. Individual gunners were supposed to put rounds in the air, saturate zones, drive fighters off, not achieve precise single aircraft kills. The accepted wisdom was that trying to hunt individual fighters pulled attention from formation discipline and increased ammunition consumption without a corresponding increase in kills. Dillman had watched that doctrine get tested in the Pacific and found wanting. He had repaired the guns of men who came back having fired 3,000 rounds without a confirmed kill. He had seen the Japanese adaptation. By 1943, you experienced zero pilots from elite units like the 251st Kokutai were probing the standard formation at its exact seams, hitting from angles that multiple guns couldn't simultaneously cover, breaking off before the overlapping fire could concentrate. They had mapped the doctrine's blind spots as precisely as any navigator. What Dillman understood, and what he had been advocating quietly, persistently to anyone who would listen, was that the answer wasn't more aircraft in formation. It was more guns on each aircraft, concentrated in positions that could reach the angles the standard arrangement couldn't cover, operated by men who had trained to hit specific targets at specific angles rather than spray defensively. He was, in a word, a specialist arguing for precision in a system designed around volume, and the crew of Old 666 agreed with him. That's why, months before this mission, they had already stripped their B-17 down to the frame and rebuilt it differently. This video gives you the story, but the Combat Blueprint, our free newsletter, gives you everything that doesn't fit in a video. Deeper details, forgotten heroes, full tactical breakdowns, stories that'll hit you harder than this one. Free to join, 10 seconds to sign up, link in the description. First issue is already waiting for you. To understand why what happened on June 16, 1943 mattered, you need to understand the problem it solved. The standard B-17E, the variant that Old 666 started as, carried 10.50 caliber machine guns distributed across 9 positions. Tail, ball turret, 2 waist positions, top turret, radio compartment, and 3 in the nose. On paper, and this gave the aircraft a 360-degree field of fire. In practice, the coverage had gaps. The most exploited gap, the nose. Early B-17 variants had minimal nose armament, a single .30 caliber weapon that a bombardier had to manually swing into position, an awkward configuration that gave attacking fighters a brief but real window. Japanese Zero pilots had studied American bombing formations through late 1942 and into 1943, and the elite units, the veterans from Rabaul, from Bucha, from Bougainville, had developed a specific counter-tactic. The frontal pass at high speed, closing from 12 o'clock level or slightly high, firing their twin 20mm wing cannons at a combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour. The physics were brutal. At that closing speed, a Zero had roughly 2 seconds in the gunner's effective engagement cone before it was passed. The Japanese pilot had approximately the same window, but the Zero carried 2 20mm cannons capable of destroying structural components with a single hit. The B-17's nose guns, at least in standard configuration, were rarely positioned to make effective use of those 2 seconds. The result, through 1942 and into early 1943, B-17s in the Pacific were being hit in the nose at disproportionate rates, engine fires, pilot wounds, bombardier casualties. The formation doctrine assumed strength in numbers, but a lone aircraft, or an aircraft separated from formation, had a structurally compromised forward defense. Add to this the problem at the opposite end of the aircraft. On the ball turret, the gunner's position Dillman now occupied had its own limitation: ammunition. The standard belly turret on a B-17E carried 500 rounds per gun, or 1,000 rounds total. In a sustained engagement firing in controlled bursts, that supply lasted approximately 8 to 10 minutes of active contact. 8 to 10 minutes. The engagement Dillman was about to enter was going to last 40. The Japanese formation commanders knew this arithmetic as well as any American gunnery officer. They had developed a patience tactic: send a first wave to suppress, provoke maximum expenditure, then bring in the second and third wave after the defensive ammunition was critically depleted. Against standard configuration B-17s in a formation, this was costly but theoretically viable. Against a single aircraft outside formation, it was very nearly a formula. Nobody had yet shown that formula was wrong. Dillman's counter-theory was not subtle. It was, in retrospect, almost obvious, which is part of why the institutional resistance to it was so frustrating. His argument: if the standard ammunition load was insufficient for sustained combat, change the ammunition load. If the standard gun positions had blind spots, add guns that covered those spots. If the standard nose armament was inadequate, install heavier guns in the nose. Stop treating the B-17 as a bomber that happened to carry defensive weapons and start treating it as a weapon system that happened to carry a bomb load. The Army Air Force's procurement and maintenance regulations of 1943 did not encourage this thinking. Aircraft modifications outside the approved modification program required authorization through channels that moved slowly. Zimmer's crew had, politely, not waited for those channels. Over the preceding months, the eager beavers had systematically rebuilt Old 666. They increased the total gun count from 10 to 16 active weapons and carried 3 additional .50 caliber spare guns in the aircraft's catwalk, ready for immediate swap if a weapon failed in combat. They upgraded every remaining .30 caliber position to .50 caliber. They reinforced the nose with 3 heavy machine guns where 1 light weapon had been. They installed a fixed forward-firing .50 caliber on the pilot's control station, directly usable by Captain Zimmer himself, and critically, they increased the ball turret's ammunition capacity. By June 16, 1943, the standard 500-round load per gun had been supplemented. Additional belted ammunition had been rigged into the turret's feed system, a field modification of the kind that made official Army Air Force's armaments officers nervous. It worked. The ball turret on Old 666 was carrying a substantially larger supply than any standard configuration B-17 in the Pacific. The first test of this approach had come on earlier missions. The results were measurable. The crew was achieving more confirmed hits per engagement, fewer incapacitating weapon failures, greater sustained fire. Other squadron commanders had noticed. Some asked questions. A few expressed skepticism about the non-standard modifications. The eager beavers' official record showed what the skepticism didn't stop: kill credits mounting, marked aircraft returning from missions that standard-configured B-17s might not have survived. By June 1943, the crew had flown enough missions to know their approach worked. What they hadn't yet done was prove it against a coordinated attack by 20 or more fighters over an unescorted, unmapped piece of open Pacific sky. That test was now 4 minutes away. The original mission briefing for June 16, 1943 was already dangerous enough. A single B-17, one aircraft, no escort, no formation, would fly 600 miles from Port Moresby over open ocean to the island of Bougainville. Once there, it would conduct a photo mapping run of the western coastline, specifically Empress Augusta Bay, the planned landing zone for a future marine amphibious assault. The maps were essential. Without precise data on coral reef positions, landing craft approaching the invasion beach could be snagged on submerged obstacles and raked by shore fire before a single Marine got overboard. The mission required straight and level flight during the photography run. No evasion, no deviation, steady altitude, steady heading, steady airspeed, for however long the cameras needed to work. If Japanese fighters intercepted during that window, the crew could not maneuver to evade. They had to hold course and shoot. 9 men were flying the mission. Captain J. Zemer in the pilot seat, co-pilot Lieutenant J.T. Britton, navigator Lieutenant Ruby Johnston, bombardier Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnosky at the nose guns, Sergeant William Vaughn on radio, Sergeant George Kendrick operating the photo equipment in the waist, and simultaneously serving as the only waist gunner, Sergeant Herbert Pudgy Pugh at the tail position, and Forrest Dillman, the last-minute addition, locked into the ball turret below. At 25,000 feet, the outside air temperature was approximately minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the ball turret, with no insulation beyond his flight suit, Dillman would feel every degree of it on his hands whenever the gun's heat dissipated between bursts. He was carrying approximately 1,400 rounds per gun in the modified feed system. 2 guns, 2,800 rounds total. In a standard engagement of 8 to 12 minutes, he would fire roughly 600 to 800 rounds. Against the engagement he was about to face, the math was unforgiving. 2,800 rounds divided by 40 minutes of sustained combat, 70 rounds per minute if he fired continuously. He had a standard burst rate of approximately 100 rounds per second of trigger contact. That meant he could fire for 28 total seconds out of every 60 if he wanted to make his ammunition last the full fight. 28 seconds per minute. That is not a comfortable number when you can see 17 fighters climbing toward you. Now comes the wrong intelligence. The night before takeoff at 10 p.m., Zemer received a last-minute call from V-Bomber Command. Naval intelligence had flagged increased activity at Buka Island, a separate, smaller island north of Bougainville, separated from it by the narrow Buka Passage. The crew was instructed to perform a reconnaissance of Buka Airfield before beginning the Bougainville mapping run. It was presented as a minor addition, a quick overflight, snap some photographs, and continue south to the primary mission. What the intelligence had not conveyed was the scale of what was happening at Buka. The 251st Kokutai, one of Japan's elite naval aviation units, had recently transferred to Buka. They were not the depleted, inexperienced units American crews had been encountering more frequently as the Pacific War ground down Japanese pilot reserves. These were veterans, men who had flown from the carriers at Midway, from Rabaul, from the Solomons campaign. Men who had fought long enough to develop the specific counter-tactics against American defensive gunnery that had been killing B-17 crews for the past year. When Old 666 arrived over Buka Airfield at dawn, Forrest Dillman looked down from the ball and reported what he saw. 21 enemy fighters parked wingtip to wingtip, in with more visible in revetments around the field's perimeter. Several were already running their engines. 21. The briefing had suggested modest Japanese presence at Buka. Now here's the curiosity puzzle this crew carried forward for the next hour. Why, once those 21 Japanese pilots watched a lone American bomber circle over their airfield at 25,000 feet, photographing them in broad daylight, did only a portion of them launch an immediate interception? Where did the others go? At 0740 hours, with approximately 60 seconds remaining in the photography run over Bougainville, Sergeant Pugh called from the tail position. More fighters lifting off from Buin Airfield, south of Bougainville. A separate wave. The first 8 A6M30 fighters from the 251st Kokutai hit Old 666 from the front. The Japanese tactic, exactly as Dillman had analyzed it, was a coordinated nose attack at closing speed. 8 aircraft attacking from 12 o'clock in echelon, banking slightly to place their 20mm cannon fire into the forward fuselage. It was the approach that standard B-17s could not effectively answer. Old 666 was not a standard B-17. Lieutenant Sarnowski at the nose guns opened fire. Ziemer triggered his fixed forward gun from the pilot's seat. The Japanese formation hit a wall of .50 caliber fire that no B-17 nose had previously generated. The first zero in the attack wave flew directly through it and disintegrated. A second broke off streaming smoke. Momentary disarray in the attacking formation. But the lead Zero's 20mm cannon had fired first. 4 shells hit the cockpit and nose in rapid succession. A 1-shell burst destroyed the pilot's side instrument panel. Another hit Ziemer's legs. Left leg fractured above and below the knee, large fragment wound in the left thigh. In the nose compartment, an explosion hurled Sarnowski physically backward from his gun position. The blood from Ziemer's wounds was pooling in the seat. He kept flying. Below the aircraft, Dillman was fighting a different engagement entirely. The ball turret's field of fire was the lower hemisphere, roughly the world beneath the aircraft's belly. As the Japanese formation split, some attacking from above, some trying to climb up from below, Dillman became the primary defense against the lower attacks. Ammo status, 2,800 rounds. First contact. 2 confirmed Japanese aircraft destroyed by forward guns. The Zero pilots now entering stage 2. After the initial shock of a nose attack that cost them fighters instead of the expected easy kill, they pulled back briefly, reassessing. The Americans should have been crippled by that opening exchange. Their instruments were partly destroyed. Their pilot was gravely wounded. Their nose gunner was down. They were wrong on every count. Sarnowski, wounded, pulled himself back to his gun. He hit a second Zero on its follow-up pass before the blood loss overwhelmed him. Ziemer, unable to feel his left leg on the rudder pedal, flew by feel and vision alone, maneuvering the bomber in precise arcs that brought Dillman's turret and the tail guns into alignment with attacking fighters at specific angles. He was not flying to evade. He was flying to give his gunners shots. And this was the second layer of Dillman's doctrine at work. The pilot as a weapon system component, not a survivor trying to escape, but a precision element turning the aircraft to maximize gunner effectiveness. The Japanese pilots, who had been named by their own enlisted men Tsume no Kami, the Claw Gods, for the way their coordinated formation seemed to reach through defensive fire and pluck out crews, circled at extended range for approximately 90 seconds after the first pass. Then they adapted, Instead of frontal attacks, they began trying simultaneous attacks from multiple axes simultaneously. Ammo status: approximately 2,100 rounds remaining in the ball turret. The incoming fighters attacking from below and from the flanks found Dillman's turret moving in smooth, controlled arcs. Short, precise bursts rather than long, suppressive sprays. Each burst was calculated, each target was acquired and tracked through the gun sight. The turret's gyroscopic controls allowed him to hold a lead angle on a crossing target that a fixed gun gunner could not maintain. At 07:45, new orders came over the interphone. They were ordered to descend. The reason? A 20mm shell had severed the oxygen system. At 25,000 feet without supplemental oxygen, the crew had minutes before hypoxia set in. Ziemer pushed the nose down, a controlled dive from 25,000 feet to 8,000, losing 17,000 feet of altitude in 2 minutes. At 8,000 feet, the air was breathable. It was also warmer. The Japanese fighters did not have the range problem they'd have at altitude and could press attacks more aggressively. The engagement was not over. It was changing. At approximately 818 minutes into the engagement, the oxygen dive had leveled out at 8,000 feet. Old 666 was still flying, still photographing. Incredibly, Kendrick in the waist was still running his camera, the mapping documentation still accumulating frame by frame through the chaos. Ziemer had passed out briefly during the dive. Co-pilot Britton had caught the controls. When Ziemer came back, he resumed command, his left leg effectively useless, blood soaking through both layers of his flight gear. In the ball turret, Dillman had been rotating through a sustained combat arc for 22 minutes. His hands were numb from the -40 air he'd absorbed during the altitude phase, now beginning to warm but not yet to functional temperature. And the Brownings were hot. The ambient temperature of fired .50 caliber weapons in sustained use reaching over 300 degrees at the barrel. But the receiver and bolt area where his hands operated the firing controls were cold metal. Ammo status: approximately 1,400 rounds remaining. At this point came the civilian complication that no one in the crew could have planned for. As Old 666 descended through 8,000 feet, leveling out over water east of Bougainville, Kendrick's camera continued to capture imagery. The photographs, taken in sequence mechanically triggered through the full combat engagement, were recording not just the terrain of Empress Augusta Bay, but the positions of Japanese defensive installations, anti-aircraft emplacements, and coastal artillery that the bombardiers and planners in Port Moresby didn't yet know existed. The film magazine in Kendrick's camera was nearly full. If the aircraft went down before reaching New Guinea, if Ziemer's wounds forced a ditching, or if a critical hit ended the flight, every frame of that film went to the bottom of the Solomon Sea. The Marines who would land at Empress Augusta Bay in November would approach those beaches without knowing where the reefs were, without knowing where the guns were. Hundreds of them, possibly thousands, could die in landing craft caught on coral that could have been mapped against guns that could have been charted. The film was not yet safe. The mission was not yet complete. And Dillman now had 1,400 rounds for a fight that was not finished. Now the curiosity puzzle from Section 5 resolved itself, and the additional fighters from Buka, the ones that hadn't immediately launched, had been circling at altitude, waiting. Their tactic: let the first wave deplete the Americans' ammunition, then send in a fresh attack. At approximately 0807 they came. The second wave came from below. The Japanese element leader, later identified from post-mission intelligence as a senior petty officer from the 251st Kokutai, had watched the first 40 minutes of the engagement and reached a precise tactical conclusion. The B-17's tail and upper positions were still firing with discipline. The nose had gone quiet after Sarnosky went down. But the ball turret, the one position that had been actively tracking and hitting fighters attacking from beneath, showed a pattern. Between the altitude dive and the level off, there had been a gap, a perhaps 12 seconds where the ball turret had not fired. The Japanese element leader had counted it. He brought his fighters in from below and slightly aft, the exact angle where a fatigued gunner with reduced ammunition might hesitate. Dillman did not hesitate. From the post-mission intelligence compiled by V Bomber Command, including survivor accounts from Japanese pilots who participated in the engagement and were later interrogated, the ball turret gunner of Old 666 was described as firing in patterns that the Japanese formation had not encountered from a B-17 before. Instead of the predictable sweeping arcs of suppressive fire that characterize standard gunnery doctrine, the turret was holding fixed angles for brief, at very precisely timed bursts, as if the gunner was waiting for a specific point in the attacker's flight path before firing. He was. Dillman had spent months watching gun footage and studying the arc of attacking Zero approaches. The specific pass geometry of a Zero attacking from below and behind, a climbing approach at approximately 30 degrees, put the fighter in a predictable position relative to the defending aircraft for approximately 1.5 seconds at the point of maximum vulnerability, just before the pilot had to commit to either the attack or the break. In that window, the ball turret's guns could bring both barrels to bear at near-optimal deflection. He had been waiting for that window, shot after shot, 8 to 12 seconds between engagements, conserving rounds, waiting for the moment. E-ammo status, approximately 800 rounds when the second wave hit, then 600, then 400. The second wave fighters broke. 3 of them did not return to base. At 08:45, 45 minutes after first contact, the remaining Japanese fighters, low on fuel and ammunition themselves, turned for home. The total credited kills from the engagement, a minimum of 5 confirmed aircraft destroyed. The crew's own accounts, consistent with post-engagement physical evidence, and the intelligence compiled from Japanese after-action reports, placed the number closer to 7. The 251st Kokutai's own records, declassified after the war, acknowledged the loss of multiple aircraft on June 16, 1943, attributed to the encounter with a single heavily armed American bomber over Bougainville. In the specific language of those declassified reports, and the ball turret gunner was cited as the source of the primary defensive fire from the aircraft's lower hemisphere. The Japanese formation commander noted that the aircraft appeared to have been modified for sustained independent combat, a recognition that what they had encountered was not a standard bomber defending itself, but a weapon system fighting offensively from a fixed position. It was, in 4 words, exactly what Dillman had argued for. Old 666 leveled out at 8,000 feet, Zemer barely conscious, both legs shot, flying 580 miles back to Port Moresby on instruments he could only partially read and with flight controls that responded imprecisely. To Sergeant Johnny Abel, who had moved up from the ball turret vacancy to the engineer position for this mission. Climbed from the belly position to the cockpit on 2 wounded legs and found Zemer covered in blood with a fire burning in the oxygen system behind his seat. Together with Johnston, they beat the fire out with their hands. Sarnosky died in the nose compartment before the aircraft reached New Guinea, his hand still on the trigger of his gun. Old 666 landed at 12 noon. 8 hours after takeoff. When the debrief officers finished their reports and the medical teams cleared the wounded from Old 666's battered fuselage, V Bomber Command issued a request that would set the direction of Pacific heavy bomber armament for the next 2 years. The request was for a full technical evaluation of Old 666's modification package. Within 30 days of the June 16th mission, the 43rd Bomb Group's armament procedures had been reviewed. Within 60 days, V Bomber Command had issued guidance encouraging squadron-level armament chiefs to evaluate similar heavy modification programs for other B-17s operating in the Pacific theater. The philosophy: more guns in nose positions, heavier caliber across all positions, increased ammunition capacity, crew-directed fire rather than doctrine-directed suppression, had been proven in the most direct possible way. It had kept a lone aircraft alive against a coordinated attack by 20 fighters for 40 minutes. Captain Ziemer and Second Lieutenant Sarnowski were each awarded the Medal of Honor. Only the third time in American history that 2 members of the same crew received that decoration for a single mission. Every other member of the crew received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. This mission remains the most decorated single-air mission in American military history. The film Sergeant Kendrick had been running throughout the engagement, through the nose attack, through the altitude dive, through 40 minutes of gunfire, developed successfully. Every frame was intact. The photographs of Empress Augusta Bay showed the reef lines with the precision that landing craft navigators would need. The photographs of Buka showed the defensive installations that planners hadn't known existed. In November 1943, when the Marines came ashore at Bougainville, their landing craft used charts derived from Old 666's photographs to thread through the reefs at Empress Augusta Bay. No landing craft hung up on coral, and no Marines were caught in the water before they could reach the beach. The film that Dillman's guns had protected, frame by frame, burst by burst for 40 minutes, was credited by General George Kenney, commanding general of Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific, as a decisive factor in the success of the Bougainville landings. The Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force, both in their own post-war analyses, cited the 1943 Pacific engagements. Specifically, the increasing armament density of modified American aircraft as a factor in their shifting tactics. By late 1943, the coordinated formation frontal pass that had been decimating B-17 crews had become less viable against the more heavily armed aircraft appearing in theater, and the doctrine that Dillman and Ziemer's crew had improvised in a New Guinea maintenance bay had, within 6 months, become standard operational philosophy. The photograph Dillman carried in his breast pocket, his wife and their son, came back from Bougainville in the same pocket it had left from. Worn from the cold, slightly damp from sweat but intact. He took it out on the tarmac at Port Moresby, looked at it for a moment and put it back. He had places to be. Technical Sergeant Forrest Dillman survived the war. He returned home carrying the Distinguished Service Cross, an award whose citation described, in the measured language of official commendation, a man who had fired from a single position for 40 minutes against a coordinated attack by veteran enemy pilots and had not stopped. He went back to being a mechanic, and there is a specific kind of man who, after surviving something like the flight of Old 666, does not seek to remain defined by it, who returns to the ordinary world and finds in the ordinary work of his hands something more honest than the ceremony and the citations. Forrest Dillman was that kind of man. He did not lecture, he did not write a memoir. He fixed things that were broken and made sure the tools were ready for the next person who needed them. Captain J. Zemer, who spent months in hospitals recovering from the wounds of June 16th, who had refused medical attention until the last Japanese fighter turned for home, went on to become a lieutenant colonel. He married in 1949, raised 5 daughters, and rarely spoke of the mission, and his wife Barbara later noted that he felt guilty about Sarnowski's death, that despite the Medal of Honor, despite the decorations, the loss of his bombardier sat with him in a way that no ceremony ever addressed. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery in May 2007. He was 88 years old. He was, at the time of his death, the last living Medal of Honor recipient of the United States Army Air Forces. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski is buried at the Philippines American Cemetery and Memorial in Manila, the city where Zemer's fellow Marine, Manila John Basilone, had once learned to box in the years before the war found them both. There is a display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a full exhibit dedicated to Zemer, Sarnowski, and the Eager Beavers. If you go, you look for the photograph of the crew. Find the man who is not a pilot, not an officer, the technical sergeant who was the armament chief, who was not supposed to be on this mission, who climbed into a glass sphere 44 inches across and held his fire until the moment counted. The principle that Forrest Dillman demonstrated on June 16, 1943 has not changed in 80 years of military aviation. Precision under pressure outlasts volume under panic. He did not spray. He waited. He aimed. And the men who would have died on those Bougainville beaches in November, men who never knew his name, came home because he did. If this story meant something to you, if the courage of these men deserves to be remembered, hit the like button. Subscribe if you're not already part of this community, and then ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And if someone in your family served in the Pacific, in Europe, in any theater, in any generation, tell us their name. Tell us their branch. Let's keep those names here in this space where they belong. You are part of keeping these memories alive. That is not a small thing. We'll see you on the next mission.